We've had a lot of successful projects, but some of our projects have failed. So today I want to talk about the common things and patterns we discovered between these failed projects and how you can use them to prevent your own projects from failing. So the first common thing we noticed was that these projects had a very poor cost structure. And that meant that we had a fixed cost, and this fixed cost was tied to requirements. But then the second problem was that these requirements were poorly documented. And because the requirements were poorly documented, and as the project progressed, we only discovered that we had to do more than we expected. And because the costs were tied to a false list of requirements, it meant that the cost couldn't cover building the actual things that needed to get built, and that constituted a problem. The third issue we noticed between these failed projects was that there was infrequent communication. Communication wasn't steady between us and the stakeholders. There were long periods of time where there was no communication at all. Either we're waiting for them to give us feedback on something we had built, or we took a long time to get back to them on things we were building. And this meant that whenever we did come back and have some form of communication, the requirements had to change. So this just created a whole lot of problems, ultimately leading to the failure of these projects. So the point here is we've learned a lot from our successful projects. We've also learned a lot from projects that have failed. So after experiencing these failed projects, here are a list of things we did that made sure that our subsequent projects were successful. So we've made sure that we apply the right cost structure for the project. If it's going to be a fixed cost project, that fixed cost has to be tied to something. And if it's going to be tied to requirements, then those requirements have to be clearly defined as much as possible. Even though we still give room for some changes along the way, but they wouldn't end up being major changes. And if costs have to be tied to time, then this has to be clearly communicated to the client before the project starts. Thirdly, we've ensured that for every project we start, we set up a constant communication cycle, whether it's weekly, every 2 weeks, or once a month. This guarantees that communication is not lost between us and the stakeholders. So we always meet to discuss the project progress, whether we have good news or bad news. So as simple and as obvious as these things seem, these are kind of things that cause projects to fail in reality. So if you're experiencing a combination of these things in your project, then you should probably take action to make sure your project doesn't fail. If it's just one of these things you're experiencing, then it's easier to handle. But usually they come in combinations, and these combinations are what drag your project into failure.